biologist from West Virginia, and my wife was looking over my shoulder a few weeks ago while I was preparing this talk, and she looked at this title slide and she said, "No way, you're going to put them all to sleep with some nerdy title." So I thought, well, what test do I get to figure out if somebody's in urinary retention? I thought, well, I'm always ordering post-void residuals or PVRs. So I came up with this, with apologies to Shailene Woodley. I know that many of you in the room have grandchildren, have probably seen the movie The Fault in Our Stars, and it's a real tearjerker, and I thought, well, this might be a better title slide. The focus of our talk today is Tycho Brahe, who was the renowned Danish astronomer, who moved to Prague in 1599 upon the invitation of the Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II. Tycho developed the sudden onset of urinary retention in 1601 at age 54. For a variety of reasons, this was treated medically rather than surgically, and he died of renal failure and urosepsis within 2 weeks. One result of his untimely death, though, was the development of modern physics. Tycho was sandwiched between two more well-known astronomers, Copernicus, pictured on the left, who popularized the sun-centered or heliocentric model of the universe, and Galileo on the right, who developed the telescope. But in many regards, Tycho was a bridge between these two eras. Not only was he the last of the great naked eye astronomers, but he was the first modern astronomer who based his theories on meticulous observation rather than on conjecture alone. But conjecture is nowhere more evident than in the model of the universe that was promulgated by Aristotle and which held sway for 2,000 years, was modified by Ptolemy in the 2nd century AD to account for apparent planetary retrograde motion. What does that mean? Well, skywatchers have always been puzzled by the movement of the visible planets. Mercury and Venus never stray very far from the sun, and Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn progress slowly eastward through the zodiac, but for several months each year they will pause and then reverse course westward for several months, pause again, and then resume their normal eastward migration. So this retrograde motion was a puzzlement to believers in the geocentric view. Ptolemy made these, they called them epicycles, where the planets not only followed a course around the Earth, but they also orbited around their own orbit. Sort of like aerobatic maneuvers. The church was not too concerned about the scientific aspects of this, but they were concerned that Earth be the central focus of the universe. After all, we're God's creation, and we should be at the center of the universe. However, there was a lone voice in the wilderness, Aristarchus of Samos, who very few people are aware of today, who said, I really think that this whole thing would be a lot simpler if we just put the sun at the center of the universe. So for about 1,800 years, nobody took that up until a good Catholic named Copernicus wrote a work called On the Revolution of the Planets and dedicated the work to the Pope and popularized Aristarchus's ideas that the planets orbited the sun rather than everything orbiting the Earth. And Copernicus believed that the planets orbited the sun in perfect circles at constant speeds, but that each planet had a different speed around the sun. And this is analogous to runners at a track meet, where the faster runners on the inside track would pass the slower runners on the outside track. Everyone's moving forward, but from different perspectives, it appears that some of the runners are moving backwards. Well, this was the universe that Tycho was born into, and at this point, people were starting to appreciate that perhaps there was another view to the universe. Well, Tycho began his work at his island observatory near Copenhagen, which was called Uraniborg. You can see it was a rather large building. Tycho had 8 children. His wife Kirsten and he had 8 kids. They also had a pet moose. Apparently this animal was very tame and would wander through the castle in and out of people's rooms. There's a story that Tico once loaned the moose out to a friend for his amusement, but the friend wasn't too careful and let the moose get into a keg of beer, and the moose got drunk and stumbled down some steps and broke its neck, and that was the end of the moose. But there was also room for some hanky-panky at Uraniborg. There's a story also that Tico was kind of a ladies' man and was getting a little bit too friendly with the queen, and that's one reason why he got kicked out of Denmark. But at any rate, that's another story. There was a lot of good science going on also at Uraniborg. If you were a budding young astronomer in the late 16th century, you wanted to work with Tycho Brahe. An apprenticeship with Tycho meant an academic appointment anywhere, and Tycho received letters from young people all over Europe who wanted to come and work with him. And on the lower right, we see a diagram of Tycho and his apprentices using what's called a mural quadrant. And what this is an arc of 90 degrees with the upper limb pointed towards the zenith, which is the point directly overhead, and the lower aspect pointed towards the horizon. And this was calibrated in 5,400 parts. A degree contained 60 arc minutes. And this was an accuracy which was unheard of in the pre-telescopic era for measuring celestial positions. So just to give you an idea of the accuracy which they were looking at the sky, the full moon encompasses an arc of half a degree as seen from the Earth, which is 30 arc minutes or 1,800 arc seconds. So using this instrument and others in his possession, and also years of observation, Tycho made 2 key observations which seemed to show that the Copernican model of the universe was flawed. Well, first he found that he could not detect stellar parallax. Well, what in the world does that mean? Well, Tycho reasoned that if the Earth really is moving around the sun, as Copernicus said, he should be able to detect a slight variation in star positions every 6 months when the Earth was on opposite sides of the sun. Now we know now that stellar parallax does exist for the nearer stars, but it's on the order of an arc second. You need a very powerful telescope to detect this. But Tycho was confident enough in his methodology and his instruments that he was willing to go out on a limb and say that the absence of stellar parallax meant that the Earth must be at the center of the universe. And then secondly, he found that planetary retrograde motion is variable from year to year, and this was most notable for Mars. What this means is, one year Mars might retrograde 10 degrees. Another year it might retrograde 9.5 degrees. The next year it might retrograde 10.5 degrees. If the planets are orbiting the sun in perfect circles, like Copernicus said, retrograde motion should be the same every year. So, on the basis of these observations, Tycho made his own model of the universe in the late 1500s. And according to Tycho's model, the Earth is the center of the universe. The sun and moon orbit the Earth. However, the other planets orbit the sun as it, in turn, orbits the Earth, to have everybody sufficiently confused. But Tycho believed that his theory was potentially acceptable to both the scientific and religious authorities. This was the first century of the Reformation. Religious wars raged across Europe. It was not the time to stick your neck out and tell people that the Bible was wrong. So all Tycho needed now was someone to help him translate thousands of data points that he had collected to prove that his theory was correct. Now, about this time, Tycho received a manuscript from a brilliant young German mathematician. And this manuscript was called The Cosmographic Mysteries. And its author proposed that the same intervals which apply to notes in the musical scale and relationships between the regular solids like tetrahedron, cube, octahedron, all these mathematical relationships were reflected in the geometry of the universe. And Tycho had never read anything like this before, so he immediately sent a letter back to this young man and offered him a job and said, I want you to come to Prague, because by this time Tico had been kicked out for whatever. But he was left his native Denmark. He was established in Prague. I want you to come to Prague and help me prove my theory. I forgot to tell you the name of the young man. It was Johannes Kepler. So Kepler comes to Prague, but things didn't go too well in the beginning because Tico was very protective of his data, and for good reason, because he'd had a lot of apprentices over the years, and he had a few young people who had plagiarized his work. So he'd only give Kepler whatever he needed for that particular day to try and establish his theory. Well, Kepler didn't like this. He knew he had a lot to contribute. He wasn't just a number cruncher. And he had also been corresponding with Galileo in Italy. And he actually threatened to leave and go work for Galileo. But the subsequent science of physics was saved by, of all things, a dinner invitation. And this dinner invitation came from a local noble, Baron Peter von Rosenberg, who nobody's ever heard of, but in his day he was well known in Prague. He was known as a dilettante, a patron of the arts and sciences, and loved to surround himself with fascinating people, probably also wanted his horoscope. Now, Tico and Kepler were established astronomers, and they know, like astronomers do today, that astrology is bogus, but heck, it meant a good dinner. So most of what we know about that evening comes from Keplers Diary. Now, both Tico and Kepler were family men, but from Kepler's description of the evening, it sounds a little like boys' night out. The wine was flowing, but Tico was too polite to excuse himself to the restroom in the presence of such a distinguished host. And so he left the evening with a very full bladder, and upon returning home, he was in great distress because he could not void. Well, the elephant in the room is, why didn't anyone try to catheterize Tico? Catheters were a well-established modality during that period in history. There were wax catheters, there were catheters made out of horn. There's no question that he could have been catheterized. The story becomes even stranger when we realize that Tico's main physician, Jan Yesenia, a university professor known all over the continent, had even written a treatise on different types of catheters to use in difficult situations. So his primary care provider was an expert on urinary catheterization. Why wasn't he catheterized? Well, the most likely explanation is Tico was probably just too skittish to allow anyone to catheterize him, or perhaps Yesenia was not on call. The physician who was on call was Johannes Wittek, who was probably just out of his training, and thought that Tico had a bladder stone and had ruptured his bladder. And it's really an ingenious theory, because what would cause you to retain urine just from holding your water? Well, a bladder stone would be forced down tighter and tighter into the bladder neck the more urine that's in your bladder. So at any rate, Tico took mercurials in a futile attempt to make urine. He became obtunded from urosepsis and uremia and died within 2 weeks. On his deathbed, he is reportedly have said to Kepler, "Let me not have died in vain." So the first thing that came to mind after Tico was gone was, does somebody bump him off? There was certainly no lack of candidates. There were enemies at the Danish court, jealous relatives, even Kepler were implicated. 300 years after his death in 1901, Tico's remains were exhumed, mainly to see if his body had been stolen during the 30 Years' War. But a positive identification was made by a nasal injury that Tico had received in a sword fight when he was a university student. And they took some hair samples and then reinterred him. Now, these hair samples were subsequently shown to have traces of mercury. And this led to the writing of a best-selling book about 10 years ago, which placed the blame on Kepler for poisoning his mentor. So in 2010, to answer these and other questions, a team of anthropologists from Denmark and Czechoslovakia were given permission to re-exhume Tico's remains and subject them to modern forensic analysis. So this is Tico's autopsy, performed after 400 years. I actually had some contact with the project leader. This is Professor Jans Velev, who is an anthropologist at Aarhus University in Denmark, who was kind enough to respond to my letters. They've published their results, but he assured me that the minute traces of mercury in Tico's hair indicated a non-toxic exposure and were probably medicinal in nature. In addition, there was no evidence of a bladder stone in Tico's remains, and furthermore, they did a CT of the skeletal remains, and this showed no evidence of metastatic prostate cancer. So what was the diagnosis? Dr. Wittick's idea of a bladder stone was a good one, but that wasn't what did it. Could it have been BPH, benign prostatic hyperplasia? Well, if the median lobe of the prostate is big enough, it could be forced down into the bladder neck the fuller the bladder gets. But Tico's only 54, so it's unlikely that he would have had such advanced prostatic hyperplasia. What about prostate cancer? Well, certainly in my practice, whenever a youngish man comes in urinary retention, that's the first thing I think of. If a sudden onset of urinary retention, an otherwise healthy man, could be prostate cancer. Well, we just don't know. There was no evidence of metastatic prostate cancer in the remains, but it's possible that Tico may have had prostate cancer. What about some chronic illness like diabetes that might have weakened Tico's bladder? All we can say is that if Tico had a chronic illness, he disguised it pretty well, because the last entry in his observing log was 2 days before the party. Well, as many questions as there are regarding Tico's demise, its effect on the development of physics is crystal clear. With Tico gone, Kepler inherited all of his voluminous data, and over the next 20 years, Kepler digested all of these data points into 3 laws of planetary motion, a simple and elegant way to express everything that Tico had ever done. And what Kepler found was that the planets, including the Earth, orbit the Sun in elliptical paths. And the genius of this work was not appreciated during Kepler's lifetime. Kepler himself suffered great hardship as he lost his entire family to smallpox. He eventually returned to Germany, where he had to defend his mother from charges of witchcraft. But he died of a febrile illness at age 59, but it was the next generation of scientists that were able to realize that implicit in these laws of planetary motion is the existence of a universal force of attraction between bodies, directly proportional to their masses and inversely proportional to the square of the distance separating them, all from an episode of urinary retention. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Like I said, you broaden our horizons of urology. Do we have any questions? And if not, we're going to take a short break.